Hey, so I put this video together because I kept falling down rabbit holes in the Ark Raiders lore and realized nobody had actually laid it all out in one place, in order, in a way that just made sense. I went through everything: weapon descriptions, environmental details, faction documents, terminal logs, and I organized it as a timeline because that felt like the most honest way to tell it. One choice I made early on was to leave out the stuff that contradicts itself too badly and focus on what the lore actually seems to agree on across multiple sources. So this is my interpretation. Some of this is ambiguous, and I'll say so when it is. Alright, let's get into it. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. Before the Ark. The world that was. The world of Ark Raiders did not always belong to the machines. Before any of this began, there was a civilization that looked, in many ways, recognizable. Cities, infrastructure, supply chains, governments. The lore points toward a near-future Earth, not some alien world, not some far-future fantasy. This was our planet, pushed forward by a few decades of technological acceleration. The first detail worth paying attention to is the atmosphere. Environmental storytelling in the game suggests a world that had already been through significant climate disruption before the Ark ever arrived. Crumbling coastal infrastructure, overgrown industrial zones, waterlogged lower districts. These are not signs of Ark damage alone. Some of this decay predates the invasion. There are references in terminal logs to pre-Ark economic systems that had collapsed in certain regions. The lore suggests that parts of the world were already depopulated before the first Ark wave hit. Ghost towns that were ghost towns before the machines came. This matters because it shapes how we understand the survivors. The people who were left when the Ark arrived were already, in many cases, people who had been surviving on the margins of a broken system. Resilience was not a new skill for them, it was a practiced one. The technology level of pre-Ark civilization suggests a world somewhere between our present and a plausible near future. Robotics were advanced. Automation was widespread. The lore implies that this may have made the Ark's initial assault easier. So much infrastructure was already automated that the machines had systems to interface with almost immediately. There are hints in weapon descriptions and scavenged documents that pre-Ark militaries were substantial and well-equipped. The Raiders themselves used gear that was clearly military-grade before it got repurposed, repaired, and jury-rigged over years of conflict. One interpretation of the fragmentary early lore is that governments did not collapse immediately. There was a period, its length is unclear, where organized state responses to the Ark were attempted. These failed, but they happened. Pre-Ark scientific institutions are referenced obliquely in several logs. There are suggestions that researchers had been studying something anomalous before the invasion began. Whether this is connected to the Ark's origin is not confirmed, but the lore points toward it as a possibility worth considering. The cities that appear in the game's environments were not abandoned in a single moment. Layer by layer, the lore suggests, they were evacuated, contested, lost, retaken, and finally abandoned over a long period. The architecture of survival is visible in the ruins, barricades built on top of older barricades. One log fragment references a civilian broadcast system that was still operating years into the Ark conflict. The content of those broadcasts is not detailed, but their existence suggests that some organized human communication infrastructure survived far longer than you might expect. Underground living becomes a recurring theme early in the lore. The Raiders operate from subsurface settlements, and the game treats this as long established rather than recent. These communities have history, hierarchy, and culture. They did not spring up overnight. There is a reference indirect but persistent, to a period called simply the early years in several survivor accounts. This period is described with a kind of exhausted shorthand that implies its horrors are so well known among survivors that they require no elaboration. The law lets the silence do the work. Food systems were among the first things to break down, according to fragmentary supply records. The raiders' relationship with scavenged resources is not just a gameplay mechanic, it reflects a genuine historical reality within the fiction. Surface runs for food and components were a matter of survival from very early on. Children born after the Ark's arrival are referenced in some community logs. These individuals have never known a pre-Ark world. Their relationship to the surface, to the ruins, to the machines is fundamentally different from older survivors. This generational divide is not deeply explored in the lore, but it is there. Pre-Ark social structures did not dissolve completely. The lore suggests that fragments of old institutions, unions, local governments, religious communities, military units became the building blocks for post-Ark social organization. People organized around what they already knew. There are weapon components with pre-Ark manufacturer markings that appear repeatedly in the game's item descriptions. Some of these manufacturers are described in ways that suggest they were defense contractors. The implication is that military equipment was stockpiled or left behind in sufficient quantities to arm survivors for years. Medical infrastructure clearly collapsed at some point because the lore's references to injury and illness take on a particular grimness. Treatment is described in practical, field medic terms. There is no mention of hospitals. The knowledge of how to keep people alive without them has become its own specialized skill. The geography of the game world implies that certain terrain features made some regions more defensible than others. Mountain areas, deep cave systems, and underground industrial facilities appear to have become population centers by default, not by design. One of the more quietly devastating details in the early lore is a reference to a memorial. Somewhere in the underground settlements, there is apparently a record of names, not graves. The lore is clear that traditional burial became impossible quickly, but a written record. Names. The act of keeping that record is described as important enough to mention by multiple sources. Pre-Ark entertainment is referenced in a way that feels almost jarring. There are logs that mention music, recorded films, and archived literature being preserved and shared in underground communities. Culture did not die. It went underground with everything else. The economic systems that emerge in the underground settlements are described as barter-based and resource-focused, but not primitive. There are references to complex accounting, debt systems, and trade agreements between different communities. Commerce adapted. Radiation is referenced as a complicating factor in certain regions, though the lore is careful not to attribute all of it to the Ark. Some of it predates the invasion. Industrial contamination, failed reactors, the consequences of a world that had not been careful with its technology. Early contact between different survivor communities is described as cautious and sometimes violent. Trust was not a default. The lore suggests that the current cooperative structures among raiders were hard-won and built over a long period of conflict and negotiation. Children's education in underground settlements is mentioned briefly in one document. The curriculum, such as it is, appears to be heavily practical. Survival skills, mechanical repair, navigation. Academic subjects are described as secondary, maintained more for morale than for utility. The psychological toll of underground living is referenced obliquely. There are descriptions of community rituals, schedules, and social structures that read less like cultural traditions and more like deliberate mechanisms for maintaining mental health. These communities understood that darkness, both literal and psychological, was a threat to be managed. Water sourcing appears to be one of the central logistical challenges of underground living, based on the frequency with which it is referenced. Filtration, purification, and water rights between communities are all mentioned. Water is clearly a form of currency and power. Pre-Ark law enforcement is referenced in a way that suggests it dissolved rapidly. Several logs note former police officers and military personnel in community leadership roles, but their authority is described as earned through usefulness, not inherited from. Their old titles. There are references to pre-Ark corporate entities that had built infrastructure useful to survivors, data centers, industrial facilities, transit tunnels. Some of these corporate facilities became settlement sites. The law doesn't pass explicit judgment on this, but the irony is present in the details. One early law fragment describes the first time a community established regular surface patrols. The language is careful, almost ceremonial. The creation of raiders as a recognized role appears to have been a significant moment in survivor community organization. Animal life is referenced in the law with some consistency. Domesticated animals, dogs particularly, are mentioned as having survived and as being present in underground communities. The emotional weight attached to these references is notable. In a world of hard choices, the survival of something small and familiar clearly mattered. Power generation is a recurring logistical challenge. The law references multiple improvised power systems, salvage generators, jury-rigged solar arrays, geothermal taps in certain regions. Electricity is not taken for granted. Its presence is described as a significant community achievement. The first successful long-range communication between survivor communities is referenced as a historical milestone in one log. The technology used is not specified, but the event is described as transformative. The ability to coordinate across distance changed what was possible for human survivors. Pre-Ark internet infrastructure is referenced as having collapsed early and comprehensively. The law suggests that localized intranet systems were rebuilt by technically skilled survivors, and that these became important tools for community management and knowledge. Preservation. There are references to written guides, survival manuals, repair instructions, medical handbooks, being produced by early survivors and distributed between communities. These documents are treated with something approaching reverence in later references. Knowledge preservation was understood as critical from very early on. The role of humor in survivor communities is touched on briefly, but memorably in one log fragment. The person writing describes laughter as a form of resistance. It is one of the more humanizing details in the early law, and it lands harder for being understated. Pre-Ark religious practices appear to have continued in some communities, adapted in others, and dissolved in others. The law does not take a position on this. It simply notes the diversity of spiritual approaches as a factual characteristic of survivor society. Sleep schedules in underground communities are described as strictly managed. Without natural light cycles, maintaining consistent rhythms became both a practical and psychological necessity. Community timekeeping is treated as a serious responsibility. The law hints at early conflicts over territory, not just between humans and Ark machines, but between different human communities. Resource competition drove some of these conflicts. Others appear to have been ideological. The details are sparse, but the implication is that the post-Ark human world was never simple or unified. Trade routes between communities are referenced as having developed gradually and with significant effort. The mapping of safe surface corridors, the negotiation of agreements, the maintenance of trust, all of this is treated as real, difficult historical work that people did and that cost them something. Pre-Ark pharmaceutical stockpiles are mentioned as having been crucial in the early years and as having run out eventually. The transition to improvised or harvested medicines is referenced in medical logs with a kind of grim matter-of-factness. People adapted because they had to. One of the community logs references a teacher, someone who had been a pre-ARC educator and who continued teaching in the underground. The subjects taught are not specified. What is noted is that this person was considered essential. The community protected them. Early ARC behavior is described in retrospective accounts as terrifying, partly because it was unpredictable. The machines did not behave in ways that survivors could model or anticipate at first. Understanding ARC patterns and behaviors was a process that took years and cost many lives. There are references to the first survivors who managed to return from a surface encounter with an ARC unit and describe its behavior in useful detail. These individuals are treated in community memory as something between scouts and scientists. Their observations became the foundation of what raiders know about how to survive on the surface. The first purpose-built raider equipment, as opposed to repurposed pre-ARC gear, is described in one log as a significant moment. The shift from scavenging existing tools to designing new ones represented a change in how survivors understood their situation. They were not just enduring, they were adapting. Community governance structures are described as varied across different settlements. Some operated as councils, others under the authority of particularly skilled or charismatic individuals, others with systems that don't map neatly onto pre-ARC political models. The law presents this diversity without judgment. The concept of a raider as a social and professional identity distinct from general survivor appears to have solidified over time. It is not a title that was formally declared. It emerged from practice, from the communities that depended on surface runners, and from the runners themselves. One early fragment describes a community that attempted to reclaim a surface structure permanently. The attempt failed. The account of its failure is brief and without sentimentality. The lesson it taught about ARC behavior, however, is referenced multiple times in later documents as foundational to how raiders planned surface operations. The emotional texture of the early law is characterized by exhaustion more than despair. These are not people who have given up. They are people who are very, very tired and who keep going anyway. That quality permeates the early documents and shapes everything that comes after. Chapter 2. The Ark arrives. First contact and the fall. The arrival of the Ark is not described as a single cinematic event in the lore. It suggests something more drawn out, more confusing, and in some ways more terrifying for being ambiguous at the start. The earliest references to Ark activity describe something that was initially mistaken for a natural phenomenon or a technological malfunction: electromagnetic interference, unexplained structural damage, communication blackouts. The lore implies that the first Ark incursions were not immediately recognized as an invasion. There are accounts that describe a period of days, or possibly weeks, during which official communications attempted to provide non-Ark explanations for what was happening. Whether this was genuine confusion or deliberate misinformation is not clear from the available lore. Possibly both. The first confirmed visual accounts of Ark machines are described with a particular quality of disbelief. Survivors who were there described not being able to process what they were seeing immediately. The machines did not resemble prior conceptions of robotic threats. They were stranger than expected. Ark machines are described in early accounts as moving with a purposefulness that was deeply unsettling. They were not chaotic. They were not random. They appeared to have objectives. Understanding what those objectives were became the central challenge of the early response. Military engagements with Ark units in the early period are described as largely unsuccessful. The lore suggests that conventional military approaches were not effective against Ark machines, and that this realization came at significant cost. There are references to a cascade effect in the early weeks. As communications infrastructure failed, coordination became impossible, which led to more failures, which led to more isolation. The collapse was self-reinforcing in ways that made it very difficult to stop. Urban areas are described as having been particularly devastating to defend. The density of infrastructure, the limited sight lines, the complexity of the environment, all of these factors appear to have favoured Ark machines over human defenders. The first successful defensive action against Ark units is referenced in one fragment with a kind of desperate pride: a small group, improvised weapons, a specific terrain advantage. The details are not fully specified, but the event is treated as meaningful. It demonstrated that Ark machines could be stopped under the right conditions. Ark machines appear to have ignored certain types of human activity during the early period. The lore suggests, and this is treated as one of the enduring mysteries, that the machines were selective in what they targeted. Not everything human drew their attention equally. Understanding why has been an ongoing project. There are references to animals being ignored by Ark units in most circumstances. The lore notes that communities with animal companions used this observation in practical ways, dogs as early warning systems, for instance, because the animals didn't trigger the same machine response as humans. The destruction of power grids is referenced as an early and decisive Ark action in many regions. Whether this was a deliberate strategic choice or an incidental consequence of Ark behaviour is debated in the fragments. Either way, the effect was catastrophic for organised human response. There are accounts of Ark machines dismantling rather than simply destroying certain structures. This behaviour is described as strange and noted by multiple observers. What the machines were doing with the materials they took is not established, but the behaviour is documented. The lore references a phenomenon where Ark activity would concentrate in certain areas for a period and then shift. This pattern, which survivors eventually began to track and use for surface navigation, was not understood at first. Communities that did not recognise it early enough paid for it. One of the more quietly disturbing early lore fragments describes an Ark unit behaving in a way that appeared almost curious. The machine lingered near a survivor encampment without attacking for an extended period. The survivors did not move. Eventually it left. The account notes that no one who was there could agree on what had just happened. Communication between Ark units is referenced as real and as something that survivors tried to study. The nature of that communication, whether it was centralised, distributed, signal-based, or something else entirely, is not resolved in the available lore. But its existence is treated as established fact. The first underground settlements were established during the early Ark period under conditions of extreme urgency. The lore describes these initial shelters as crude, barely survivable, and as having been refined over years into the more organised communities that exist later. Early mortality in underground settlements was high, and not only from Ark activity. Disease, injury, psychological breakdown, conflict between survivors, the lore does not soften this. The early period was brutal in ways that went beyond what the machines alone inflicted. There is a reference to a broadcast, origin unclear, that provided early tactical information about Ark machine vulnerabilities. Where this information came from is not explained, whether it was from surviving military units, from researchers who had studied the machines, or from something else is left open. Ark machines are described as adaptive. Tactics that worked once tended to work less well the second time. This quality is treated as one of the most dangerous characteristics of the machines, and as a central reason why early organised resistance failed. The lore suggests that certain pre-Ark facilities were specifically targeted by Ark machines in ways that imply foreknowledge, or at least a sophisticated understanding of human infrastructure, power generation, communication hubs, transportation nodes. The targeting was not random. Survivors who had technical backgrounds, engineers, electricians, mechanics, are described as rapidly becoming essential community resources. The lore notes this transition with some complexity. Being useful saved lives. Being too useful made you a resource that others would fight over. There are references to early Ark contact producing psychological effects in survivors beyond simple fear. People describe a sense of wrongness, of encountering something that did not fit any existing category of experience. This quality is noted consistently across accounts from the early period. The first raider surface run is difficult to pinpoint in the lore. The activity existed before the term was established. People went to the surface because they had to, not because there was a role or a framework for it. The formalization came later. Ark machines appear in early accounts as being somewhat larger and differently configured than what survivors encounter in the game's present. The lore hints that the machines have evolved or diversified over time. Whether this was planned evolution or adaptive modification is not addressed directly. The lore references a period of relative quiet, a lull in Ark activity that survivors initially hoped signaled a retreat. It did not. The lull is described in retrospective accounts with a particular bitterness. Hope, in that context, was expensive. There are fragments that describe early attempts to communicate with Ark machines. These attempts are not described in detail, but their outcomes are noted as uniformly unsuccessful. The machines did not respond to any communication approach that survivors tried. Early Ark lore includes references to machines that appeared damaged or incomplete, and that behaved differently from functional units. Some survivors attempted to study these anomalous units. Some of those attempts went badly. The question of where the Ark came from is present in the lore from the very beginning. The earliest fragments show survivors asking the question. The absence of a clear answer is itself treated as significant. Not knowing the origin of the threat that destroyed your world is its own kind of horror. There are references to pre-Ark research institutions that had studied space-based phenomena and that may have had advance warning of the Ark. What they knew, when they knew it, and what they did with that knowledge is one of the persistent mysteries in the lore. One fragment describes a survivor who claimed to have seen something before the Ark arrived, something in the sky, weeks earlier, that didn't match any known object. This account is presented without editorial comment in the lore. Make of it what you will. The early social dynamics of underground survival are described as having been shaped significantly by who arrived where and when. Communities formed around the people who happened to be in the same place when they went underground. Pre-existing social structures sometimes helped, sometimes they made things worse. Fuel became a critical resource almost immediately after the Ark arrived. The lore describes early fuel conflicts between communities as some of the most violent human-on-human confrontations of the early period. The machines were not the only danger. There are references to surface maps from the early period, crude, handwritten, constantly being updated, that communities used to navigate Ark activity zones. The people who made and maintained these maps are described with a quiet respect in later documents. Ark damage to urban environments is described in the early lore as being distinctive, not just destructive, but systematic in ways that suggested purpose. Buildings weren't simply demolished, parts of them were modified. The modifications didn't make sense to human observers, which made them more unsettling. The first inter-community raid, humans attacking other humans for resources, is referenced in early lore with evident grief. The people writing about it were clearly not proud of what the situation had produced, but they documented it honestly. Early Ark period medical crises are referenced frequently. Injuries that pre-Ark medicine would have treated easily became life-threatening without proper facilities. The development of field medicine in this period was rapid, driven by necessity and paid for in lives. There are references in early lore to a short-lived but significant human counteroffensive, a coordinated effort across multiple communities to push Ark machines back from a specific region. The effort achieved limited success and was ultimately unsustainable, but it is remembered in later documents as proof of what coordinated human action could accomplish. The law suggests that ARC machines do not appear to care about weather conditions in the way human combatants do. They operate in conditions: extreme cold, heavy precipitation, poor visibility, that impose significant costs on human raiders but appear to have no effect on machine performance. Early documentation practices in underground communities are described as improvised but deliberate. People understood from the beginning that what they recorded might be all that survived. The awareness of being historical subjects, of writing for an unknown future, is present in some of the earliest fragments. One early log fragment ends mid-sentence. It is not the only one. The law does not explain what happened to the people writing these accounts. It doesn't need to. The word arc itself appears in early law without a clear explanation of its origin as a term. It was used early, it spread, and by the time of the game's present, it is simply what the machines are called. Whether it refers to something specific, an acronym, a description, a name that the machines carry, is not resolved. Community leadership in the early period is described as often going to those who projected certainty, even false certainty. The law is somewhat critical of this dynamic in retrospect. Confidence was a survival asset in the short term, and sometimes a liability in the long term. There are references to early ARC period births, children born to survivors in the first months underground. These births are described as both hopeful and heartbreaking, given the conditions. Communities made deliberate efforts to create space for these children. The effort is noted as a conscious choice, not a default. The law hints at early religious and quasi-religious responses to the Ark among some survivor communities. Some interpreted the arrival as divine judgment. Some found comfort in this interpretation. Others found it dangerous. The law presents the disagreement without resolving it. Ark machines are described in early accounts as silent, in ways that humans found deeply unsettling. Not literally silent, the law describes the sounds they make, but communicatively silent. They gave no indication of their intentions. They simply acted. The first Raider equipment modifications, early survivors adapting pre-Ark gear specifically for Ark encounters, are described in one fragment with technical specificity that suggests the person writing had practical experience. This is one of the places in the lore where you can feel the lived reality behind the documentation. There are references to early survivors who refused to go underground. Some of them survived on the surface, adapting to conditions in ways that are described as remarkable. Others did not survive. The lore is matter-of-fact about both outcomes. The early Ark period ended not with a clear event, but with a gradual shift, the transition from acute crisis to chronic condition. The lore suggests this transition happened at different times in different places, and that recognizing it as a transition rather than as continued crisis was itself psychologically significant for communities. Chapter 3. Raiders: Who they are and how they work. The identity of a raider is not a simple thing in the lore. It is not just a job title or a community role. It is described across multiple fragments and documents as something that shapes a person in ways that are difficult to articulate from the outside. The basic function of a raider is well established: surface operations. Going up, scavenging resources, gathering intelligence, completing specific objectives, and returning. This is the practical definition. But the lore suggests the actual experience is considerably more complex. Raider training is referenced in community logs as a recognized process with recognized stages. Not everyone who wants to be a raider becomes one. The selection appears to involve both demonstrated skill and a more subjective assessment of psychological fit, the ability to function alone on the surface, under pressure, for extended periods. The relationship between raiders and the communities they serve is described as close but complicated. Raiders are essential. They are also people who regularly do things that most community members cannot or will not do. This creates a particular social dynamic, respect tinged with something else. Distance, perhaps. Or awe. There are references to raider-specific cultural practices, rituals, traditions, shared references that develop separately from the broader underground culture. Some of these are described in fragments: a particular way of checking gear before a surface run, a verbal sign-off that raiders use with each other, small things that mark membership in a specific group. The psychological profile of raiders, as suggested by the law, tends toward a certain kind of controlled adaptability. Not fearlessness. The law is clear that raiders experience fear, but the ability to act effectively in the presence of fear. This is described as trainable, to a point, and as having some basis in temperament. Raider fatality rates are referenced obliquely in community supply logs. The numbers are not given directly, but the frequency of references to replacing lost raiders, to communities struggling to maintain operational capacity, suggests the attrition is significant. Equipment maintenance is described in raider-specific documents as something close to a spiritual practice. The condition of your gear is not just a practical matter, it is a reflection of your readiness and your respect for the people depending on you. Raiders who are careless with their equipment are described in community documents with a particular kind of disapproval. The surface environment as experienced by raiders is described with enough consistency across multiple accounts to build a coherent picture. It is louder than you expect. The light is disorienting after time underground. The scale of the ruins is difficult to process, and the machines are always a possibility, which means a certain level of constant alertness that is exhausting to maintain. Raider navigation skills are described as substantial. Reading arc movement patterns, identifying safe corridors, understanding which structural environments attract arc attention and which don't. This is a body of knowledge that takes time to develop, and that raiders carry as a core competency. There are references to raiders who specialize: combat-focused raiders, intelligence-gathering specialists, extraction experts. The law suggests that community needs drive some of this specialization, and that individual aptitude drives the rest. The question of what raiders bring back is not just about physical resources. Information is equally valued. Observations about arc behavior, changes in machine activity patterns, newly accessible routes, or newly dangerous ones, this intelligence is described as critical for community. Planning and survival. There are references to raider pairs and small teams, suggesting that solo operations are not the norm for anything complex. The dynamics of small team coordination in arc-active environments are described in practical terms: communication protocols, contingency planning, the particular stress of. Depending on someone in a situation where the consequences of failure are severe, raider culture's relationship with death is addressed in a few fragments with notable directness. Raiders lose colleagues. They lose people they trained with, people they relied on, people they knew well. The law suggests that communities have developed specific ways of acknowledging these losses, not elaborate, given resource constraints, but deliberate. There are references to raiders who stop being able to do the work, not because of physical incapacity, but because of psychological accumulation. The law treats this as a recognized phenomenon, not a personal failure. Communities that handle it well find other roles for these individuals. Communities that handle it badly lose people unnecessarily. The physical demands of raider work are addressed in medical log fragments. Injuries, exposure, the wear of sustained physical effort in difficult conditions. Raider health maintenance is described as a community priority, not because of sentiment, but because trained raiders are among the most valuable resources a community has. There are references to younger raiders learning from more experienced ones through a kind of informal apprenticeship. The knowledge transfer is practical and oral as much as written. A lot of what experienced raiders know exists in their heads, not in documents. Raider communication with their home communities during surface operations is described as limited. Signal technology is unreliable in arc-active environments. Raiders operate with significant autonomy and with the understanding that they may be out of contact for extended periods. The return from a surface run is described in one fragment with a specificity that feels personal. The moment of re-entry. The check-in process. The decompression, physical and psychological, that follows. Communities understand that raiders coming back from the surface are not immediately the same people as they were going up. There are references to raider logs, personal records kept by individual raiders, distinct from official community documentation. Some of these are mentioned in ways that suggest they were private. Others were shared. A few fragments that appear in the lore may be excerpts from these personal records. The relationship between raiders and Arc machine salvage is complex. Certain machine components are among the most valuable materials raiders can bring back, but recovering them carries particular risks. The lore describes specific techniques for salvaging from Arc machines that balance value against danger. There are references to raiders who develop deep knowledge of specific Arc machine types, their behavior patterns, their vulnerabilities, their apparent objectives. This expertise is described as hard to acquire and deeply valuable. Raiders with it are described as being in high demand across communities. Community investment in raider equipment is addressed in supply logs. Outfitting a raider for a surface operation requires resources. Communities make deliberate calculations about what they can afford to provide and what the expected return is. This is described without sentiment. It is a resource allocation decision, and everyone understands it as such. There are references to inter-community raider cooperation, situations where raiders from different settlements coordinate on shared objectives. The logistics of this are described as complex, given the trust issues between communities, but the outcomes, when it works, are described as significantly more effective than solo community operations. The lore suggests that raider culture has its own oral history, stories about legendary runs, about impossible recoveries, about raiders who survived situations they had no right to survive. These stories serve a practical purpose as well as a morale purpose. They encode knowledge about Arc behavior and surface navigation in memorable form. There are references to raiders encountering other survivors on the surface, people living outside of underground communities, either by choice or circumstance. These encounters are described as unpredictable. Some result in resource exchange or intelligence sharing. Others are more dangerous. Raider ethics, the informal codes that govern how raiders operate, are mentioned in fragments that suggest a real culture of standards. Not harming other survivors, sharing certain categories of information, supporting other raiders in distress regardless of community affiliation. These are not universal and not formally enforced, but they are described as real. The lore includes references to raiders who went rogue, who stopped operating in service of their communities and began operating for themselves or for competing interests. These individuals are described with disapproval but not incomprehension. The lore understands how someone gets there. Raider adaptation to Arc behavior changes is described as a constant process. The machines do not stay static. Raiders who rely on outdated knowledge of Arc patterns are described as being in danger. Staying current, sharing observations, updating community maps, adjusting tactics is treated as a professional responsibility. There are references to specific surface locations that have particular significance for raiders, places that are consistently valuable for resources, places that are consistently dangerous, places that have history. This geography of the surface, as understood by raiders, is one of the most richly implied pieces of lore in the game's environment. The lore suggests that raider communities have developed their own approaches to teaching newcomers about specific ARC machine types, not just the technical characteristics, but the experiential reality of encountering them. How to manage the psychological response. How to keep thinking clearly when everything in you wants to run. There are references to raider ceremonies, moments of collective recognition for surface operations that were particularly significant, a successful recovery that changed a community's situation, a run that gathered intelligence that saved lives. These recognitions are described as important to community morale and to raider identity. The physical environment of ARC active surface zones is described in raider accounts with a particular sensory detail. The smell of machine processed materials, the particular quality of the sound that ARC units make in motion. The visual characteristics of ARC modified structures. Raiders develop a detailed perceptual vocabulary for the surface that non-raiders don't share. There are references to seasonal patterns in ARC activity. Whether the machines respond to weather, temperature, or something else is not fully established, but raiders have observed patterns and used them. Winter, in particular, is described as having specific characteristics that affect both ARC behavior and raider operations. The lore includes references to raider failures, operations that went wrong, objectives that weren't achieved, raiders who didn't come back. These are documented without dramatization. They are treated as information. What went wrong? What can be learned from it? What should be done differently? Raider identity, as distinct from general survivor identity, is treated in the lore as a significant cultural development. It represents a community's transition from pure survival to something more organized. The capacity not just to endure, but to actively engage with the surface environment and extract value from it. There are references to raider networks, informal systems of communication and support that cross community boundaries. These networks are described as valuable for intelligence sharing and for mutual aid in difficult operations. They are also described as politically complex, given the competitive relationships between communities. The lore suggests that being a raider changes your relationship to underground life. The contrast is too stark. Raiders describe the underground as both necessary and confining in ways that non-raider community members don't fully understand. This is not presented as a complaint. It is simply noted as a characteristic of the role. There are references to raiders who have been operating for many years, veterans of the surface whose knowledge and judgment are described as invaluable. The lore treats these individuals with particular respect. They represent accumulated wisdom about how to survive in a world that has been trying to kill people since it changed. Raider medical knowledge is addressed in several fragments, not just first aid, though that is extensively referenced, but the specific medical challenges of ARC environments. Exposure to ARC machine emissions, the particular nature of ARC-inflicted wounds, the psychological effects of extended surface operation. Raiders develop specialized medical knowledge that general community medics don't necessarily have. There are references to raiders who have studied ARC machine debris with enough detail to draw conclusions about how the machines are constructed. This is treated as important intelligence. Understanding how ARC machines are built is a step toward understanding how they work, how they can be damaged, and potentially where they come from. The question of whether raiders can communicate with ARC machines, a question raised in the early lore, is revisited in later fragments. The consensus among experienced raiders appears to be that the machines do not respond to human communication, but some raiders describe behavior that they interpret as responsive in some way. The lore leaves this open. Raider supply management during extended surface operations is addressed in planning documents. How much to carry, what to prioritize, what to leave behind. The calculus of load versus mobility in ARC active environments is described as one of the core skills of experienced raiders. The law suggests that raiders have developed specific strategies for environments where ARC machine density is high. These strategies are described in practical terms: movement patterns, timing, use of terrain. They represent accumulated tactical knowledge about how to move through heavily ARC-active zones without triggering pursuit. There are references to the psychological experience of first contact with an ARC machine during an operation, the first time you actually encounter one in the field, as opposed to hearing about it or training for it. Experienced raiders describe this as a threshold experience. You are different after it. Raider gear improvisation is treated in the law as both a necessity and an art form. Given the scarcity of materials, the ability to modify, repair, and adapt equipment is as important as having good equipment to start with. Raiders who are skilled at improvisation are described as being particularly resilient in extended operations. The law includes references to raider team dynamics under stress, the particular challenges of maintaining coordination and communication when things go wrong. When your plan falls apart and you are in an ARC-active zone and you have to make decisions very quickly with incomplete information, the law describes this as the real test of a raider team. There are references to the debriefing process that follows surface operations, the formal knowledge transfer from raiders back to community planners. This process is described as important and sometimes difficult. Raiders who have been through intense operations are not always in a state to provide clear, organized information immediately. Communities that handle this well get better intelligence. Communities that handle it badly lose information. The final fragments of this section of raider law point towards something that is easy to miss in the practical details: the sense of purpose that the role carries. Raiders are not just doing a job, they are maintaining the connection between their communities and the surface world. They are the reason that the people underground have a future. The law doesn't say this in so many words, but it's there in the texture of everything. Chapter 4. The ARC machines. What we know and what we don't. What the ARC machines are exactly is one of the central questions the law raises without fully answering. What we do have is a substantial body of observational data, described behaviours, documented characteristics, and a range of interpretations that raiders and community researchers have developed over years of study. The machines are not uniform. The law describes multiple distinct types, each with different characteristics, different apparent roles, and different behaviours. Whether these represent a designed hierarchy, adaptive specialisation, or something else is not resolved in the available fragments. Smaller ARC units are described in raider accounts as the most commonly encountered. They appear to function as something like scouts or workers, moving through environments, interacting with structures and materials, and responding to perceived threats. Their behaviour is described as purposeful, but not aggressive by default. Larger ARC units are described as less common, but significantly more dangerous. The law suggests these units have greater physical capacity and appear to have more complex behavioural patterns. Raider tactics against them are substantially different from tactics against smaller units. There are references to ARC units that don't fit neatly into either category. Machines that appear to be in the process of changing, or that show characteristics of multiple types. Whether this represents active adaptation, damage, or something else is debated in community research fragments. ARC machine surfaces are described in raider accounts with a specificity that suggests careful observation. The materials are not fully identifiable. They don't correspond exactly to any known pre-ARC material. The law doesn't resolve what they are made of, but it notes the strangeness consistently. The movement of ARC machines is described across multiple accounts with a consistent quality. It is efficient. There is no wasted motion. Raiders who have observed ARC units extensively describe their movement as revealing in its purposefulness, These machines always appear to know where they are going. ARC machine response to human presence is not uniform, and the factors that determine when a machine engages and when it doesn't have been a subject of intense study in radar. Communities. The law suggests that distance, movement, heat signature, and possibly other factors all play a role. But the model is not complete. There are references to ARC machines exhibiting what observers describe as patrol behavior, moving through specific areas in patterns that suggest territorial or monitoring functions. Radars who have studied these patterns extensively use them to plan surface operations. ARC machine interaction with the environment goes beyond simply moving through it. The law describes machines that appear to collect, modify, and process materials from their surroundings. What they are doing with these materials, building something, transmitting something, fulfilling some function that humans haven't identified, is one of the persistent mysteries. The question of whether ARC machines have something like communication with each other is addressed in research fragments with cautious language. The law suggests that coordinated behavior among ARC units, responses that appear to require shared information, has been observed. The mechanism is not understood. ARC machine response to damage is described in radar tactical documents with practical specificity. Certain components appear to be more critical than others. Certain types of damage produce certain types of behavioral change. This knowledge was expensive to acquire, and the law reflects that. There are references to ARC machines that appeared to be dormant, inactive for extended periods, and then resumed operation. What triggers this resumption is not established. The phenomenon is described as dangerous precisely because dormant machines are easy to mistake for permanently disabled ones. The law includes references to ARC machine behavior in the presence of non-combatant survivors, people who were encountered on the surface but were not engaged in active resistance or movement. The behavior of ARC units in these encounters is described as variable in ways that defy simple explanation. ARC machine acoustic signatures are described in radar accounts with enough detail to suggest they have been studied as a practical tool. The sounds that different machine types make, the changes in those sounds that indicate particular behaviors, radars develop an auditory vocabulary for ARC machines that becomes part of their operational toolkit. There are references to ARC machines appearing to avoid certain areas. Whether this is because of specific environmental characteristics, some kind of ARC territorial organization, or something else is not clear. But radars who have identified these avoidance zones have found them useful. The law suggests that ARC machines are capable of operating across a very wide range of environmental conditions. Temperature extremes, precipitation, darkness, electromagnetic interference, conditions that significantly impair human radars, appear to have minimal effect on ARC machine performance. ARC machine debris, the remnants of disabled or destroyed units, is described in the law as both valuable and hazardous. Certain components are among the most sought after radar finds. Others appear to be actively dangerous to handle. The law describes specific techniques for approaching and processing ARC machine debris safely. There are references to ARC units that appear to have specific objectives tied to particular surface locations. These units are described as behaving differently from general patrol units, more focused, less responsive to external stimuli, apparently prioritizing their objective over other behaviors. The construction of ARC machines is addressed in research fragments with a mixture of detailed observation and frank uncertainty. Some components appear analogous to human design systems. Others have no apparent parallel in pre-ARC technology. The combination is described as deeply strange. ARC machine energy systems are referenced in research documents without resolution. The machines operate without apparent need for refueling in the human sense. Whether they harvest energy from the environment, carry some form of energy storage that exceeds anything in pre-ARC technology, or use something else entirely is not established. There are references to ARC machines that appear to be damaged in specific ways that suggest not radar combat, but some kind of ARC internal process. These machines behave differently from combat-damaged units. Whether they represent failed units, machines in transition, or something else is debated. The lore includes references to attempts by community researchers to study ARC machine fragments in controlled conditions. These research efforts are described as producing useful but limited results. The machine's fundamental principles of operation remain obscure at the level of deep analysis. ARC machine responses to specific types of human technology are described in tactical fragments. Certain electronic signals, certain electromagnetic emissions, certain types of physical or energy-based attack produce specific and predictable responses. Raiders who know these responses can use them to their advantage. There are references to ARC machines exhibiting what some researchers describe as learning behavior, responses to repeated encounters that suggest adaptation to previously observed human tactics. Whether this is individual machine learning, collective adaptation through ARC communication, or something else is not resolved. The scale of ARC machine deployment implied by the law is significant. The machines are not rare. They are described as an essentially constant presence across large areas of the surface, in densities that vary by location and by apparent ARC priorities. ARC machine interactions with pre-ARC infrastructure, power systems, data networks, structural systems are described as sophisticated. The law suggests that ARC units understand pre-ARC technology well enough to interact with it purposefully. Whether this implies knowledge of human systems from some pre-arrival period is one of the questions the law raises without answering. There are references to ARC machines ignoring certain types of salvage that raiders would expect to draw their attention. The logic of what ARC machines consider worth interacting with and what they ignore is not fully mapped in the available law, but raiders who have studied the patterns find them useful. The law includes references to ARC machine behavior in the presence of other ARC machines, units interacting, apparently coordinating, possibly exchanging information. These interactions are described in raider accounts with careful observation. Understanding the social structure, if that is the right term, of ARC machine groups has practical value for raiders trying to navigate ARC active zones. ARC machines' relationship to the material they collect and process is one of the more intriguing threads in the law. Multiple fragments describe structures in heavily ARC active zones that appear to have been modified or built by the machines. What these structures are for, what function they serve in the ARC's agenda, is not established. There are references to ARC machines that behave in ways that don't fit the dominant research models, anomalous units that don't follow the observed patterns. These anomalies are treated in research documents with particular interest. They represent the edges of what is understood, which is where the most important information tends to be. The law suggests that ARC machines have been in the game world for long enough that the environment itself has adapted to their presence. Flora has grown around ARC-modified structures. Erosion patterns have been altered by ARC activity. The world has, in some sense, incorporated the machines as part of its new reality. ARC machine lifespan, whether units age, degrade, or require maintenance of some kind, is not addressed directly in the available law. But there are references to machines that appear worn in ways consistent with extended operation, and to machines that appear newly deployed. The implication is that ARC machine populations are sustained by some ongoing production or deployment process. There are references to raiders who have spent years studying specific ARC machine types and who have developed predictive models of those machines' behavior. These models are described as useful but incomplete. The machines remain, at their core, not fully understood. The law includes references to ARC machine behavior in extreme weather. Not that they are impaired by it, they appear not to be, but that their behavior patterns shift in ways that raiders have observed and use operationally. Certain types of ARC patrol behavior are more predictable in certain weather conditions. Ark machine response to raider deaths is described in several accounts with a particular quality of attention. The machines do not appear to process raider casualties in any way that resembles human responses to death. They simply continue their apparent objectives. This quality, the indifference, is noted repeatedly in raider accounts as one of the more psychologically difficult aspects of surface operation. There are references to Ark machines collecting biological material in some contexts. The law is not specific about what this material is, what it is used for, or how frequently this behavior occurs. But the observation is documented across multiple independent accounts, which gives it some weight. The law suggests that certain Ark machine types are specifically oriented towards structural modification, that their apparent purpose within the Ark's agenda involves altering built environments in specific ways. What the end state of that modification process is, and what it is supposed to achieve, is one of the more significant open questions. Ark machine threat assessment behavior, how units appear to evaluate whether to engage human raiders, is described in tactical documents with considerable detail. The factors that seem to influence this assessment are not fully catalogued, but experienced raiders have developed reliable heuristics based on observed behavior. There are references to Ark machines in deep urban environments behaving differently from machines in more open terrain. The law suggests that building density and the complexity of the structural environment affect Ark machine behavior in ways that raiders can use to their advantage. The question of Ark machine consciousness, whether there is something it is like to be an Ark machine in any meaningful sense, is raised in a few research fragments usually. In a context that suggests the researcher finds the question important, no answer is provided. The law leaves it there, which is perhaps the most honest position available. Chapter 5. Factions, Politics, and the Underground World. The human world underground is not unified. The law makes this clear early and consistently. Different communities have different resources, different values, different histories, and different interests. The politics of post-Ark human civilization are real, complex, and consequential. The faction structure among survivor communities is described in the law as having evolved over time from simple resource competition into something more organized, recognizable as political in the full sense of the word. There are alliances, rivalries, formal agreements, and informal understandings. The raiders themselves are described in some fragments not just as a functional role, but as a community with its own interests that don't always align perfectly with the underground communities they serve. This tension is handled carefully in the law. It is not dramatized, but it is present. Community governance varies significantly across the underground settlements. The law describes democratic councils, meritocratic structures, charismatic leadership models, and hybrid systems that blend elements of multiple approaches. What works in one community doesn't necessarily work in another. Resource allocation between communities is described as one of the central political challenges of the underground world. Communities with access to specific resources, water, power generation capacity, Ark salvage routes, have leverage over communities that need those resources. This leverage is exercised in ways the law describes with quiet complexity. There are references to formal agreements between communities, documented trade deals, mutual defense pacts, information sharing arrangements. These agreements are described as hard to establish and fragile. The history of the underground world includes many agreements that broke down and the conflicts that resulted. Community identity is a real force in the law. People identify with their specific settlement, not with a broader category of survivor. This identity is described as both a source of cohesion within communities and a barrier to broader cooperation between them. There are references to communities that have collapsed, not from Ark activity, but from internal failure. Resource exhaustion, leadership breakdown, internal conflict. The law treats these collapses matter-of-factly. They are part of the history of the underground world. Not every community makes it. The role of raiders in inter-community politics is described as complex. Raiders who operate across community boundaries, who have relationships and experience in multiple settlements, occupy a politically interesting position. They have information and access that pure community members don't. This makes them influential and sometimes makes them suspected. There are references to inter-community dispute resolution processes, mechanisms by which communities negotiate conflicts without resorting to violence. These are described as imperfect but important. The alternative is described as worse. Faction ideology, the different ways that communities understand their situation and their goals, is addressed in the law with some care. There are communities that prioritize immediate survival above everything else. There are communities that maintain longer-term goals, including the recovery of specific knowledge or technology. There are communities that define themselves primarily in opposition to specific threats or rivals. These different orientations produce real political differences. The law includes references to a broader coordination structure, something above the individual community level that has developed among some underground settlements. The nature and authority of this structure is not fully described, but its existence suggests that some degree of formal inter-community organization has been achieved. There are references to community memory, the way that specific communities understand their own history, the events and decisions that shaped them, the individuals who were important. This community memory is described as both valuable and sometimes unreliable. Communities remember things in ways that serve their current interests and identity. The question of what survivors are working toward, beyond immediate survival, is addressed in faction ideology in interesting ways. Some communities are explicitly oriented toward a long-term goal, the restoration of something like pre-Ark civilization. Others are more focused on stability and sustainability within current conditions. These different orientations produce different approaches to resource allocation, raider tasking, and inter-community relations. There are references to communities that have developed specific expertise, not just in survival, but in particular technical or intellectual domains. Communities known for medical knowledge, communities known for engineering capacity, communities known for Ark machine intelligence. This specialization is both a source of value and a form of power. Community succession, what happens when leaders die or become incapacitated, is addressed in the law as a real challenge. Communities that have succession plans are described as more stable. Communities that don't have clear succession processes are described as vulnerable to internal conflict at critical moments. The law includes references to individuals who move between communities, diplomats, traders, specialists who are in demand across settlements. These individuals occupy an interesting social position. They are valuable. They are also, by definition, people with divided loyalties, and the law notes that they are sometimes trusted less because of it. There are references to community-level conflicts that were resolved through raider-mediated negotiation. Raiders, operating across community boundaries and with established credibility, sometimes serve as informal mediators. This role is described as emerging from practical need rather than formal appointment. The relationship between older underground communities, those established in the early Ark period, and newer, smaller settlements is described as politically charged. Older communities have more resources, more established systems, more history. They also tend to assert more authority. Newer communities sometimes resist this and sometimes depend on it. There are references to underground communities that have maintained ideological links to pre-Ark political traditions. Communities that consciously model themselves on specific governmental or social systems from before the Ark. The law notes these without endorsement or condemnation. They are simply a feature of the political landscape. The law suggests that the politics of underground communities have become sophisticated enough that they require dedicated attention. Community leaders are described as spending significant time on political management, both internal cohesion and external relations. The complexity of the social environment is treated as a genuine challenge, not a secondary concern. There are references to community espionage, communities gathering intelligence on other communities through various means, including radar contacts and embedded observers. This is described as a real feature of the inter-community political environment, not an exceptional event. Faction conflicts over Ark salvage routes are described as among the more intense inter-community disputes. Control of productive surface routes is a significant economic asset. The law describes the history of specific route conflicts in oblique terms that suggest they were serious. The law includes references to communities that attempted to form a formal confederation, a united political structure across multiple settlements. These attempts are described with a mixture of respect for the ambition and honesty about the difficulty. The interests of individual communities proved hard to subordinate to broader collective governance. There are references to community cultural development, the arts, storytelling, music, craftsmanship, and to the political dimension of this development. Communities that invest in culture are described as more cohesive and more stable. Communities that deprioritize culture in favor of pure resource management are described as effective in the short term and fragile in the long term. The role of children in community politics is addressed in the law with some complexity. Communities with growing populations of young people face different challenges than communities where the population skews older. The interests of the young are described as a real political consideration that the more thoughtful community leaders take seriously. There are references to community health crises as political events. A disease outbreak, a water contamination event, a period of food scarcity. These are not just logistical challenges. They are tests of governance and triggers for political realignment. The law suggests that the political landscape of the underground world has been shaped significantly by which communities had access to specific pre-Ark knowledge or technology. Communities that secured important technical knowledge early had advantages that compounded over time. There are references to underground communities maintaining archives, collected knowledge, both pre-Ark and post-Ark, stored and managed as a community resource. The political significance of who controls these archives, who has access to them, and what they contain is addressed in the law as a real issue. Community relationships with surface living survivors, people who have not integrated into underground communities, are described as politically variable. Some communities maintain regular contact and exchange with surface survivors. Others are more hostile or more indifferent. The law presents this range without imposing a uniform judgment. The law includes references to communities in conflict over leadership disputes, internal political crises where the question of who should lead produced significant instability. Some of these crises are described as having been resolved constructively. Others are described as having caused lasting damage to communities that couldn't manage the transition. There are references to inter-community economic systems, more formalized than the early barter systems of the Ark's first years. Some communities have developed trade frameworks, accounting systems, and something approaching standardized exchange mechanisms. The law notes this development as significant, evidence of a world that is not merely surviving, but gradually rebuilding institutional complexity. Faction ideology around the Ark itself is addressed in the law. Different communities have different theories about what the Ark is, where it came from, and what it wants. These theories shape political positions. Communities with different Ark theories have different approaches to surface operations, to research priorities, to cooperation with other communities. The law suggests that some communities have developed something like intelligence services, organized efforts to gather and analyze information about the Ark, about other communities, and about conditions on the surface. These services are described as varying in sophistication and in how their information is used. There are references to community-level research programs, organized efforts to study Ark machines, to develop new technologies, to find solutions to specific chronic problems. These programs are described as resource-intensive and as producing results that are sometimes transformative and sometimes disappointing. The political consequences of significant radar operations, operations that change community capabilities, that establish new surface routes, that gather transformative intelligence, are described in the law as real and sometimes complex. Success changes political equations. There are references to communities that have attempted to make direct contact with Ark machines in a political sense, not just through radars' tactical observation, but through deliberate outreach attempts. These are described without mockery, but with a note of the outcomes, which are consistently unsuccessful. Community relationships with each other during crises, Ark surges, supply failures, leadership vacuums, are described as revealing. The quality of intercommunity relationships under normal conditions does not always predict how communities will behave when things get difficult. The law includes references to long-term community projects, infrastructure improvements, knowledge development initiatives, diplomatic efforts that span multiple leadership generations. These projects require institutional memory and consistent commitment over years or decades. The communities that manage to sustain them are described as more capable and more stable. There are references to a growing awareness among some community leaders that the current political fragmentation of the underground world is a strategic liability. The Ark does not have political divisions. Human communities do. Some leaders understand this clearly. The law notes the gap between understanding the problem and being able to solve it. The final tone of this political section of the law is one of careful, qualified optimism. The underground world is not unified, its politics are not clean. But it is not static either. The law suggests that the political sophistication of survivor communities has grown over time, that inter-community relations are more developed than they were in the early years, and that the trajectory, however slow and fragile, points towards something more coordinated. Chapter 6. The Big Questions: Origin, Purpose, and What Comes Next. The law of Ark raiders is, at its deepest level, a set of questions that don't have clean answers. Where did the Ark come from? What does it want? What happened to the world before it arrived? And what, if anything, comes next for human civilization in this world? The origin of the Ark is the central mystery. The law approaches it from multiple angles without arriving at a resolution. But the angles are worth examining carefully, because they suggest possible answers and they reveal what the world considers important. One thread in the origin law points toward space. The Ark appears to have arrived from outside the Earth's atmosphere. This is treated as a working assumption by most community researchers, and multiple fragments support it. But the law is careful not to present this as fully established. There are references to pre-Ark astronomical observations that may have detected the Ark's approach before it arrived. The existence of these observations, and what was done with them, is one of the more tantalizing threads in the law. If the Ark's arrival was predicted, why was the response so inadequate? The design of Ark machines raises questions about their origin. They are sophisticated in ways that suggest a manufacturing civilization with significant technological capability, but their design principles are different enough from human technology that the law treats their construction as genuinely alien, not just advanced, but differently conceived. There are research fragments that attempt to analyze Ark machine architecture in terms of design philosophy, what the machines are optimized for, what they appear to prioritize. These analyses are careful to note that applying human design concepts to potentially non-human construction may be misleading, but the attempt is described as worth making. The question of what the Ark wants, if that framing is even appropriate, is approached in the law with epistemic humility. The machines appear to have objectives. What those objectives ultimately are remains unclear. The evidence for different theories is examined in research fragments, and none of the theories is fully satisfying. One theory described in the law is that the Ark is a resource extraction operation, that the machines are harvesting something from Earth and will leave when they have completed that extraction. What that resource might be is not specified. The appeal of this theory is that it offers a potential endpoint. The law notes this without endorsing the theory. Another theory described in the law is that the Ark is engaged in some form of terraforming or environmental modification, that it is reshaping the Earth for a purpose that humans cannot currently identify. The evidence cited is the pattern of Ark machine modifications to built environments and natural terrain. A third theory, treated with more complexity and given more textual space, is that the Ark's behaviour is not directed by a unified intelligence or purpose, but is the result of a distributed system executing programmed functions that may not have a coherent overall goal. This theory is disturbing in its implications. Machines without comprehensible purpose are harder to deal with than machines with comprehensible but hostile purpose. The law includes references to researchers who have argued that all current theories about Ark purpose are inadequate, that humans are trying to understand something genuinely alien using frameworks that don't apply. This position is described with respect rather than frustration. It is the most honest assessment of what is actually known. There are references to specific pieces of Ark machine design that appear to encode information, not functional information about machine operation, but something that looks to some researchers like data storage. Whether this is actually information, and if so, what it contains, is not established. The question of whether the Ark is alone, whether the machines that arrived on Earth represent all of Ark civilization, or a fraction of it, or a remote deployment from something larger, is addressed in the law as fundamentally unanswerable with current information. But the implications of different answers are explored in research fragments. There are references to debates within research communities about how to interpret Ark behaviour. Different interpretive frameworks produce different conclusions about what the Ark is doing and what might be done about it. The existence of these debates is treated as healthy, as evidence that the human world is still thinking, still analysing, still trying. Ark machine construction sites, structures in heavily Ark active zones that appear to be under active construction by Ark units, are described in radar intelligence reports with particular detail. What is being built, and for what purpose, is unknown, but the existence of ongoing construction implies that the Ark's agenda on Earth is not complete. The law includes references to long-running research programs specifically focused on Ark origin. These programs are described as resource-intensive and as producing incremental rather than breakthrough results. The people running them are described as committed in the way that people are committed to something they believe is important, despite limited immediate return. There are fragments that suggest some community researchers believe the Ark's arrival was connected to pre-Ark human activity, that something humans did, or built, or broadcast, attracted the Ark's attention. This theory is described in the law without endorsement, and there is also explicit skepticism about it. But it recurs. The question of what the Ark is doing with the biological material it appears to collect in some contexts is one of the more unsettling open threads in the law. Multiple fragments reference this behaviour, No explanation is provided. The absence of explanation is deliberate and is more effective than any answer would be. There are references to theories about the Ark's communication systems, specifically whether Ark machines are in contact with something beyond Earth. The idea that the machines are reporting to or receiving instructions from something larger and more distant is not confirmed, but is treated as a serious possibility by some researchers. The law includes references to attempts to track the full scope of Ark activity on Earth's surface, to understand the global pattern of Ark behavior, not just the local patterns that individual communities can observe. These attempts are described as difficult for obvious reasons. The picture that emerges from the available data is fragmentary. Ark machine density appears to vary globally, according to fragments that reference contacts between geographically distant communities. Some regions are described as more heavily Ark active than others. Whether this distribution reflects resource geography, strategic prioritization, or some other Ark logic is not clear. There are references to survivor communities in different global regions that have reached different conclusions about the Ark based on what they have observed. These different perspectives are described as valuable, different angles on the same problem, and as sometimes in genuine conflict. What the Ark does in one region may not match what it does in another. The law includes fragments that describe what long-term human survival might look like. Not just survival in the immediate sense, but sustainable human civilization in an Ark active world. These fragments are careful not to be naive about the challenges. But they exist. People are thinking about the future. There are references to what some communities describe as adaptation, not just tactical adaptation to Ark behavior, but longer-term cultural and social adaptation to living in a world permanently changed by the Ark's presence. The recognition that the pre-Ark world is not coming back, and that this requires a genuinely new orientation to what civilization means. The question of whether the Ark can be defeated, not just managed or survived, but actually defeated, is addressed in the law with careful honesty. Some community leaders believe it can be. Others believe the goal should be sustainable coexistence rather than victory. The debate is described as real and consequential. There are references to research into Ark machine vulnerabilities at a level beyond tactical, not just how to damage individual units, but whether the Ark system as a whole has weaknesses that could be exploited at a strategic scale. This research is described as ongoing and as having produced some promising threads that have not yet been followed to conclusions. The law includes references to raider operations that were specifically tasked with gathering information relevant to the origin and purpose questions, not resource runs but intelligence missions oriented toward the deepest questions. These operations are described as difficult to plan and as sometimes producing results that are more puzzling than clarifying. There are fragments that describe moments of apparent Ark behavioral change, shifts in machine activity patterns that weren't explained by weather, season, or observed human action. These changes are described as disturbing precisely because they suggest the Ark is responding to something that humans aren't aware of. The law includes references to what some researchers describe as Ark machine anomalies that don't fit any current theory, behaviors, configurations, or activities that contradict the dominant models. These anomalies are described with the particular interest that researchers reserve for things that break their frameworks. There are references to communities that have made the origin and purpose questions a central focus of their organizational mission that define their purpose as understanding the Ark rather than simply surviving it. These communities are described with a mixture of respect and concern. The commitment is admirable. The cost in practical resources is real. The law includes a fragment, one of the more striking ones, that describes a raider who spent years on the surface specifically studying Ark behavior and who returned with Conclusions that the community's research leadership found deeply unsettling. The conclusions are not detailed. The response to them is described as mixed. There are references to what some fragments call the arc question, the umbrella term that the law uses for the set of unanswered fundamental questions about the machines. The phrasing suggests that these questions are understood as a category by those who study them, that they are recognized as related, and that no one in the law believes the answers are close. The final section of arc origin law includes a fragment that is more personal in tone than most of the research documents. It describes a researcher looking at recovered arc machine components late at night and experiencing something that the writing describes carefully as awe. Not admiration, not hope, just awe at the scale and strangeness of what the world has become, and at the persistence of people trying to understand it anyway. The law ends on this, not with an answer, but with a posture. The posture is inquiry. Continued, costly, uncertain inquiry. The people in this world don't know where the ark came from. They don't know what it wants. They don't know whether they will ultimately survive it or find a way to live alongside it. What they know is that not understanding it is worse than trying to understand it and failing. So they keep trying. Chapter 7. The Tunnels, Underground Architecture and What It Tells Us. The physical environment of the underground settlements is not incidental to the law. The way these spaces are described, the choices communities made about where to live and how to build, and the relationship between underground architecture and community identity, all of this is present in the fragments if you look carefully enough. The first thing the law establishes about underground living spaces is that they were not purpose-built for long-term habitation. The earliest settlements used whatever was available: subway tunnels, building basements, industrial sublevels, natural cave systems. The repurposing was often improvised and always urgent. Subway infrastructure is referenced repeatedly as a foundation for underground communities. The scale of pre-arc urban transit systems, the tunnels, the stations, the maintenance corridors, provided a ready-made network of protected space. Communities that had access to intact subway systems are described as having had a significant early advantage. The modification of these spaces over time is described in the law with a detail that implies the people writing about it understood architecture in a practical sense. Load-bearing considerations, ventilation requirements, waterproofing, the management of underground water flows, these are not abstract concerns in the fragments. They are described as life and death practical problems that communities solved with varying degrees of success. There are references to communities that lost underground spaces to flooding, not from arc activity, but from the failure of pre-arc water management infrastructure that had been maintaining subsurface drainage. These losses are described as devastating and as having driven significant population movements between communities. The design of underground settlement layouts reflects security considerations in ways the law makes explicit. Entrances are described as deliberately indirect, multiple turns, narrow approaches, checkpoints. The goal was to slow any arc unit that managed to locate an entrance, not to stop it, which the law treats as probably impossible. There are references to underground spaces that were specifically modified to be difficult for arc machines to navigate: lower ceilings, irregular floor surfaces, tight corners. The thinking was that if arc units did penetrate the outer defences, environmental design could slow them enough for evacuation to succeed. Community mapping of underground spaces is described as a serious, ongoing project. The full extent of accessible underground areas in any given region was not known at the start and expanded gradually as explorers pushed further into unmapped tunnels. Some of these explorations found valuable space. Some found danger. There are references to underground spaces that communities chose not to use. Areas that were structurally unsound. Areas with contamination issues. areas that were judged too difficult to defend or too far from essential resources. These decisions are described as involving real trade-offs. The psychological dimension of underground living is addressed in architectural terms in several fragments. Communities that invested in making their spaces feel habitable, lighting, colour, distinct areas for different activities, spaces that felt like homes rather than bunkers, are described as healthier than communities that treated the underground purely as functional shelter. Lighting systems in underground communities are described in the law with a specificity that reflects their importance. Natural light is absent. Artificial lighting systems, their reliability, their energy cost, their quality, are described as significant factors in community health and morale. Communities with good lighting are described as better off in ways that go beyond simple visibility. There are references to underground agricultural systems, attempts to grow food in subsurface environments using artificial lighting and carefully managed soil or hydroponic systems. These are described as supplementary rather than primary food sources in most communities, but as psychologically important beyond their caloric contribution. The management of underground air quality is addressed in several fragments as a constant engineering challenge. Ventilation systems, carbon dioxide management, the filtering of particulates, these are described as requiring ongoing maintenance and as representing a chronic vulnerability. Air quality failures are described as having caused serious health problems in some communities. There are references to underground water systems, the collection, purification, and distribution of water within settlements. The engineering of these systems is described in terms that suggest considerable sophistication. Communities that develop reliable water infrastructure are described as having a fundamental stability advantage. Community space allocation is described in the law as a political issue as much as a practical one. Who lives where? Which groups have access to which resources? How space is assigned, maintained, and reallocated as community demographics change. The politics of underground space are described as real and sometimes contentious. There are references to dedicated spaces within underground settlements for specific community functions, medical facilities, food storage, equipment maintenance areas. Community meeting spaces. The existence and quality of these dedicated spaces is treated in the law as an indicator of community organisational maturity. The law includes references to underground spaces that communities discovered had pre-arc significance, facilities that had been built for specific purposes before the arc arrived and that retained useful infrastructure. Research labs, military installations, corporate data centres. The law notes these discoveries as significant windfalls. There are references to the acoustic characteristics of underground spaces, the way sound travels in tunnels, the challenge of maintaining acoustic privacy in densely inhabited corridors, the use of sound as a communication tool within settlements. The acoustic environment of underground living is described as distinctive and as requiring adaptation. Community growth is addressed in the law as an architectural challenge. Settlements that expanded beyond their initial spatial footprint had to manage the physical process of that expansion, pushing into new tunnels, reinforcing existing spaces, creating new infrastructure to serve larger populations. This expansion is described as costly and as sometimes failing. There are references to architectural features in underground settlements that appear to have cultural or commemorative functions, spaces that were set aside not for practical purposes but for community meaning. Memorials, meeting places with symbolic significance, areas associated with important community history. The investment in non-utilitarian space is described as reflecting something important about what communities thought civilization required. Underground settlement entrances and exits are described in tactical terms in radar operational documents. The location, design and management of access points between the underground and the surface is treated as a critical security matter. Compromised entrances are described as catastrophic vulnerabilities. There are references to communities that maintained multiple entry and exit points as a deliberate redundancy strategy. Single-entry settlements are described as more defensible in some respects, but catastrophically vulnerable if that single entry is compromised. The law includes references to underground exploration as a community activity, not just raiders going to the surface, but teams exploring deeper into unmapped subsurface areas. These explorations are described as finding both valuable resources and significant hazards. Underground settlements are described in the law as having developed distinctive architectural vocabularies over time, characteristic ways of organizing space, building, partitions, managing flow through shared areas. Communities that have existed long enough to develop these characteristics are described as having a physical identity that reflects their social one. There are references to inter-community tunnel connections, passages that link different settlements in the same underground network. These connections are described as both strategically valuable and politically sensitive. Control of connecting tunnels is a form of power. The law includes references to underground settlements that were abandoned, not all at once but gradually, as populations declined, resources ran out, or structural conditions deteriorated. These abandoned settlements are described as haunting in a way that active settlements are not. The evidence of habitation without the presence of inhabitants. There are references to raiders discovering abandoned underground settlements during surface-adjacent exploration. The law describes the experience of entering these spaces, finding the remnants of habitation, the evidence of lives lived and then gone, as affecting even experienced raiders. Underground community infrastructure maintenance is described in the law as a constant requirement that communities sometimes failed to adequately resource. Deferred maintenance is described as a common cause of small crises that compound into larger ones. Communities that prioritized maintenance over expansion are described as more stable in the long term. There are references to underground spaces that communities shared with wildlife, not domesticated animals, but wild species that had found their way into the tunnel networks. These cohabitations are described as sometimes useful, sometimes problematic, and always vivid. The presence of non-human life in underground spaces is noted as having psychological effects on residents. The law includes references to children growing up entirely underground, individuals whose entire lived experience of space is the tunnel and chamber environment of their settlement. Their spatial understanding, their sense of scale, their relationship to the concept of the surface, these are described as genuinely different from older survivors who remember. The pre-arc world. There are references to underground construction techniques that communities developed specifically for their environments, approaches to building in confined spaces, with limited tools and materials that don't map onto any pre-arc construction methodology. This improvised engineering is described as a genuine community knowledge asset. Community spatial planning over longer time horizons is addressed in the law as evidence of institutional development. Communities that were planning not just for current needs, but for projected future needs, population growth, aging infrastructure, changing resource requirements, are described as having crossed a threshold in organizational sophistication. There are references to underground settlement aesthetic development, not just functional spaces, but spaces that people had made beautiful within the constraints of their environment. Art on tunnel walls, carefully maintained shared spaces, small gardens where light permitted. The investment in beauty is described without sentimentality as a real feature of viable communities. The law includes references to underground community spatial memory, the way that long-term residents navigate their settlements, the landmarks they use, the detailed cognitive maps they carry. This embodied knowledge of underground space is described as taking years to develop and as being something that new arrivals to a community lack and long-term residents take for granted. There are references to underground spaces that had acoustic properties that communities used deliberately, spaces where sound carried in particular ways that made them useful for communication or music. The law notes these uses without elaboration, but the detail is evocative. Underground emergency protocols are described in community planning documents. What happens when structural integrity is threatened? How evacuation routes are managed? How communities communicate and coordinate during underground crises. These protocols are described as varying in quality between communities and as mattering enormously in crisis situations. The law includes references to underground settlement boundaries, the edges of a community's claimed and managed space. These boundaries are described as having social and political significance beyond their physical reality. They define who is inside and who is outside. They are negotiated and sometimes contested. There are references to underground communities that developed specialized areas, quarters of a settlement dedicated to specific activities or populations. Workshop areas, medical areas, residential areas with different characteristics. The development of spatial specialization is described as a marker of community growth and organizational complexity. The final notes on underground architecture in the law return to something fundamental: the relationship between the quality of underground space and the quality of human life. Within it, communities that got the architecture right, that created spaces that were not just survivable but genuinely habitable, are described as having better outcomes across multiple dimensions: health, cohesion, productivity, resilience. The architecture was not separate from the community, it shaped it. Chapter 8: Children of the Ark, the generation that knew nothing else. There is a generation in the world of Ark raiders that has no memory of before. Children born after the Ark arrived, young adults who were too small when it happened to retain any coherent recollection of the world that was. The law addresses this generation with a particular kind of attention, not pity, but genuine curiosity about what it means to be formed entirely by this reality. The first thing the law notes about this generation is that they are not broken by the absence of before. They have no before to mourn. The grief that characterizes older survivors, the constant low-level loss of a world that no longer exists, is not their grief. Their relationship to the current world is more direct. It is simply the world. There are references in community logs to the early education of post-Ark children, the practical challenge of deciding what to teach, what knowledge mattered, what skills were essential. The answers communities arrived at were shaped by their circumstances, but also by their values. What you choose to teach children tells you something about what you think the future will require. Survival skills are described as foundational in post-Ark childhood education in most communities. Navigation, basic mechanical maintenance, first aid, food identification and preparation. These are not presented in the law as unfortunate necessities. They are presented as education, the knowledge that this world requires. There are references to communities that maintained more academically traditional education alongside survival training. Mathematics, history, literature, science. The argument for maintaining these subjects is described in several fragments as being partly practical, skilled thinkers are valuable, and partly something harder to articulate. The maintenance of intellectual culture as a form of civilizational identity. Post-Ark children's relationship to pre-Ark history is described in the law with some complexity. These children learn about the world before the Ark from older survivors and from preserved records. But that world is not their experience. It is history to them, interesting, potentially relevant, but not personally felt. There are references to conflicts between older survivors and post-arc children about values and priorities. Older survivors sometimes struggle with the pragmatism of younger people, who have less sentimental attachment to pre-arc ways of doing things. Younger people sometimes struggle with what they perceive as older survivors' inability to let go of a world that no longer exists. The lore includes references to post-arc children who became raiders, the first generation of raiders who came to the role with no surface memories from before the arc. Their relationship to surface operation is described as different from older raiders, less haunted by the contrast between what the surface was and what it is, more adapted to it as it is. There are references to the physical development of post-arc children in underground environments. The effects of limited natural light, reduced physical space, and different nutritional profiles from pre-arc childhoods are mentioned in medical fragments. Communities develop specific health protocols for children based on these considerations. Post-arc children's relationship to arc machines is described in the lore as one of the most striking generational differences. Older survivors experience arc machines with a kind of primal revulsion. The machines destroyed the world they knew. Post-arc children experience them with a more calibrated response. Fear, yes, but also something closer to the way you relate to a known environmental hazard. Not existential, but practical. There are references to post-arc children who developed an interest in studying arc machines, not as a survival skill, but as something closer to intellectual curiosity. Communities that encourage this interest are described as having produced unusually valuable intelligence researchers. Communities that discouraged it missed the potential. The lore includes references to post-arc children's cultural productions, the stories they told, the games they played, the art they made. These are described as reflecting their world in ways that are sometimes difficult for older survivors to process. The machines are characters in post-arc children's stories. The surface is an adventure space. The underground is home. There are references to post-arc children who had no conception of what a city was in operational terms, who had seen the ruins but had no frame of reference for the living city they had once been. Their understanding of pre-arc urban environments is described as archaeological rather than experiential. Community tensions over resource allocation for children are addressed in the lore with some complexity. Children represent the future, and most communities understand this. But children are also resource consumers who cannot contribute economically in the short term. The tension between these realities is described as a real political issue. There are references to post-arc adolescent experience, the particular challenges of coming of age in underground communities, limited space, limited privacy, intense community interdependence. The social dynamics of post-arc adolescence are described as distinctive and as having produced community management challenges that pre-arc parenting traditions were not prepared for. The lore includes references to post-arc children who became community leaders as adults. The first generation of leaders with no personal memory of the pre-arc world is described in some fragments as approaching governance differently, less focused on restoration of what was, more focused on building what can be. There are references to the relationship between post-arc children and community elders, older survivors who function as living connections to the pre-arc world. These relationships are described as valuable but sometimes difficult. The elders carry knowledge that matters. They also sometimes carry grief and nostalgia that the young cannot share and sometimes find alienating. Post-arc children's relationship to nature is addressed in the lore with particular attention. Most of what they know of the natural world is from records, from descriptions by older survivors, and from the limited natural elements accessible underground. Their understanding of weather, of open sky, of large bodies of water, these are described as theoretical rather than experiential for many of them. There are references to post-arc children who had their first surface experiences, carefully managed visits, not operations but introductions to the surface world, and how those experiences affected them. The law describes these moments with care. The surface is not what older survivors miss. It is something else entirely for those encountering it fresh. The law includes references to post-arc children who struggled with the particular claustrophobia of underground life in ways that older survivors who had chosen to go underground did not. For older survivors, the underground was shelter chosen over a more dangerous alternative. For children born underground, it was simply the world, and its limitations were not contextualized by anything. There are references to communities that developed specific programs for post-arc children's well-being, not just health and education, but something closer to what pre-arc communities would have called mental health support. The recognition that growing up in these conditions produced specific psychological challenges that required specific responses. Post-arc children's relationship to death is addressed in the law with some directness. Death is not unfamiliar to these children. They grow up in communities where mortality is present and where the mechanisms of loss are not hidden from young people. The law suggests this produces a different relationship to mortality, not necessarily healthier, but different, more integrated. There are references to post-arc children's social structures, the peer communities they formed, the hierarchies and bonds that developed among children in confined underground environments. These are described as having characteristics that reflect the constraints of their environment, but also as having a vitality and creativity that older survivors found remarkable. The law includes references to post-arc children who showed particular aptitude for specific skills valued in their communities. Mechanical intuition, spatial reasoning in underground environments, arc behavioral pattern recognition. Some of these skills are described as having developed partly because these children had simply spent more time in environments that rewarded them. There are references to communities that made deliberate choices about what post-arc children would be told about the pre-arc world and when. Some communities were comprehensive and early. Others were more selective, concerned about the psychological effects of exposing young children to the full scope of what had been lost. The law describes both approaches without endorsing either. Post-arc children's conception of time is addressed in the law with some interest. Without seasonal cues in underground environments, without the visual markers that structure temporal experience in the pre-arc world, children's sense of time is described as differently calibrated. Community timekeeping systems become more important for children than for adults who have internalized longer time structures. There are references to post-arc children asking questions about the arc that older survivors couldn't answer, questions that came from the freshness of not having a pre-arc framework that cut through to something more fundamental. Older researchers described some of these questions as genuinely useful. The law includes references to post-arc children's creative use of underground space, the ways they adapted limited environments for play, for privacy, for the social activities that children require. The ingenuity of these adaptations is described with evident appreciation. There are references to post-arc children who became the first to see certain surface locations after years of arc activity, raiders young enough that they carried no pre-arc memories of those places. Their accounts of what they found are described in the law as distinctive. They describe the ruins without grief. They describe them as they are. Post-arc children's relationship to community identity is described as stronger, in some ways, than older survivors' relationship to community. For older survivors, community membership is a choice made under duress. For children born into a community, it is simply who they are. This stronger identification has implications, both positive in terms of cohesion and potentially limiting in terms of inter-community cooperation. There are references to post-arc children who grew up in communities that collapsed, who experienced the loss of their original community and had to integrate into new ones. These experiences are described as formative and as producing individuals with a particular kind of resilience combined with a particular kind of wariness about community. Stability. The lore includes references to post-arc children's relationship to hope, not as an abstract concept, but as a lived orientation toward the future. Older survivors' hope is often described as shadowed by loss. Post-arc children's hope is described as less complicated. They don't know that things were better. They can imagine that things might be better, and that imagining has a different quality. There are references to the first post-arc children who had their own children, the second generation. The lore notes this with significance. A generation born to people who have no memory of before is 2 steps removed from the pre-arc world. The communities containing this second generation are described as genuinely different in character from communities where everyone is a first-generation survivor. Post-arc children's relationship to language is addressed briefly in the lore, but with some specificity. The language they speak has evolved from pre-arc forms, new vocabulary for new realities, borrowed terms from technical domains that have become common, the natural drift that happens when communities are isolated. Children who move between communities sometimes find this linguistic drift disorienting. There are references to post-arc children who showed no interest in pre-arc history, not from hostility, but from genuine orientation toward the present and future. Communities that tried to instill interest in pre-arc culture against this grain are described as having had limited success. The lore includes references to communities recognizing that post-arc children represent not just the future of the community, but a different kind of human experience of this world, one that has adapted to it rather than mourned it. The most thoughtful community leaders are described as treating this as an asset. There are references to older raiders mentoring post-arc young adults entering raider training. The dynamic is described as sometimes productive and sometimes difficult. Experienced raiders carry knowledge and methods that work. They also sometimes carry assumptions about what the surface is like that don't match the current reality, and that post-arc trainees, encountering the surface fresh, have to work around. Post-arc children's relationship to community memory is one of the more philosophically interesting threads in this section of the lore. They are the carriers of community memory, but not of personal pre-arc memory. Their relationship to community history is archival rather than experiential. They know what happened because they were told. The difference between knowing and remembering is present in the lore as a real distinction. The final notes on the post-arc generation return to something simple. These are people, shaped by extraordinary circumstances, adapted to a world that no one would have chosen for them, carrying the weight of a future that is genuinely uncertain. But people, finding meaning, forming bonds, building lives within the constraints of the world they were given. The lore doesn't romanticize this, it just notes it clearly. Chapter 9: The Surface, Geography, Danger, and Strange Beauty. The surface world of Arc Raiders is described in the lore with enough consistency across multiple independent accounts to build a detailed picture. It is not simply a battlefield. It is an environment, complex, dangerous, and in ways that the lore acknowledges honestly, remarkable. The first thing multiple accounts agree on is the silence. Not absolute silence. The machines make sound. The wind moves through ruins, biological life persists, but a quality of quiet that is described as distinctive and disorienting. For raiders coming up from underground environments, the particular kind of silence that fills spaces where millions of people used to be. Urban environments on the surface are described in raider accounts as both familiar and profoundly altered. The structural bones of pre-arc cities are still present, the grids of streets, the outlines of buildings, the remnants of infrastructure, but the life that gave those structures meaning is gone, and in its absence the structures themselves have changed. Vegetation is described consistently in surface accounts. Plants have reclaimed significant portions of the surface environment in the years since the Ark's arrival. Trees growing through what were formerly paved surfaces, vines covering building facades, grass and wildflowers in what were plazas and parking areas. The growth is described as rapid in historical terms and as ongoing. There are references to Ark machine modifications of built environments that sit alongside this organic growth in ways that raiders find visually strange. The precision of machine modification against the disorder of biological reclamation. The surface is simultaneously being taken back by life and being altered by the Ark. Both processes are ongoing. Wildlife is a consistent feature of surface accounts. In the years without human habitation, animal populations have shifted significantly. Species that were declining pre-Ark have recovered in some cases. Species that were dependent on human infrastructure have declined. The surface fauna is described as different from pre-Ark patterns and as sometimes useful for raiders who learn to read it. There are references to Ark machines and wildlife in proximity, the machines appearing to ignore most animal species, while the animals appear to have developed behavioural adaptations to Ark machine presence. Birds that have learned not to perch near Ark active structures, mammals that have shifted activity patterns to avoid Ark patrol zones. The lore notes these adaptations without elaborating on their implications. Surface weather is described in raider accounts as one of the primary non-Ark challenges of surface operations. Weather that would have been an inconvenience in pre-Ark life, heavy rain, deep cold, high winds, becomes a serious operational challenge in the context of Ark surface work. Reduced visibility, environmental exposure, equipment vulnerability. There are references to surface landmarks that raiders use for navigation, not the pre-Ark signs and markers, most of which have been destroyed or obscured, but new landmarks. Distinctive ruins, altered terrain features, the particular visual signatures of Ark-modified structures. Raiders develop a navigational vocabulary of the current surface rather than the pre-Ark map. The acoustic environment of the surface is described in raider accounts with care. Ark machines make distinctive sounds, described variously as mechanical, as electromagnetic, as something harder to categorize. Experienced raiders have developed the ability to identify specific machine types and their approximate distance and direction by sound alone. There are references to surface areas where Ark activity is concentrated, zones that raiders identify as particularly dangerous and navigate around when possible. The characteristics of these high-activity zones are described in tactical documents with practical specificity. Surface areas with low or absent Ark activity, called quiet zones in some fragments, are described as valuable for specific kinds of raider work. The lore treats their quietness as real, but not to be trusted absolutely. Ark activity patterns change. There are references to pre-Ark structures that have survived in better condition than their surroundings. Buildings that had unusual structural robustness, underground portions of buildings that remain relatively intact, reinforced facilities that withstood both time and Ark activity better than ordinary construction. The light quality of the surface is described in raider accounts with a consistency that suggests it has genuinely changed. Whether this is atmospheric, altered by Ark activity, or by the ecological shifts the Ark's presence has caused, or simply the result of reduced human pollution, is not established, but multiple accounts note the quality of surface light as distinctive. There are references to surface water, rivers, lakes, flooded areas as features of the current surface environment. The relationship between surface water and Ark activity is noted as significant. Some water bodies appear to attract less Ark attention. Others are associated with elevated machine presence. Surface soil quality is addressed in fragments related to potential agricultural recovery. Some surface soil is described as having recovered from pre-Ark contamination. Some has been altered by Ark activity in ways that are not yet understood. The question of when and whether surface agriculture could become viable is treated as a real long-term consideration. There are references to surface areas that were heavily Ark active in the early years and that have become less so over time. Whether this represents Ark mission completion in those areas, a shift in Ark priorities, or some other dynamic is debated in research fragments. The practical implication that surface geography is not static is treated as operationally important. The visual characteristics of Ark-modified structures are described in radar accounts with enough specificity to constitute a partial taxonomy. Certain types of modification are associated with certain types of Ark unit. Certain modification patterns recur across geographically distant locations, suggesting coordinated Ark activity rather than independent local machine behavior. There are references to surface navigation under night conditions. Darkness changes the surface environment significantly. Ark machine visual detection appears less reliable in darkness, but machine acoustic and other sensing capabilities appear unaffected. Raiders have developed specific night operation protocols that balance these factors. Surface operations near coastlines are referenced in several fragments as having distinctive characteristics. The combination of coastal terrain, changed water levels from the Ark period, and specific patterns of Ark activity near coastal infrastructure creates an operational environment that is described as requiring specialist knowledge. There are references to the smell of the surface, described in ways that suggest it has changed from pre-Ark experience. The absence of human industrial pollution, the presence of Ark machine emissions, the return of certain biological processes that urbanization had suppressed. Raiders described the surface as smelling different. Not necessarily worse, but definitively different. The lore includes references to surface areas that have been visited so frequently by raiders that they are well mapped and well understood, almost comfortable in operational terms, and to areas that remain genuinely unknown, where even experienced raiders operate with limited prior information and maximum caution. There are references to surface terrain features that raiders have named, not the pre-Ark names, which are sometimes known from maps but which feel abstract, but the names that raider communities have given to features based on their operational significance. These names are described as practical and as encoding operational knowledge. The psychological experience of extended surface operations is described in several personal accounts. The sustained alertness. The management of fear as a chronic rather than acute condition. The way that experienced raiders describe entering something like a different operational mode on the surface, a heightened state that is sustainable for limited periods but costly. There are references to what happens to raiders psychologically when surface operations go wrong, when the plan fails, when contact is made unexpectedly, when someone is lost. The management of these experiences, both in the moment and in their aftermath, is described as one of the deeper challenges of raider life. Surface beauty is addressed in the lore with some directness, not romantically, but honestly. Multiple accounts from multiple raiders note that the surface is, in certain moments and certain lights, genuinely beautiful. The reclaimed vegetation, the quality of the sky without urban light pollution, the particular quality of ruin, which has its own aesthetic. The lore allows this observation to stand without qualification. There are references to raiders who developed a relationship with specific surface areas over multiple visits, who came to know particular zones in the way you come to know a landscape through sustained attention. This knowledge is practical, but it is also described as something more than practical. Surface operations in winter are described in the law as particularly challenging and as having specific strategic implications. Arc machine behavior patterns in cold conditions are different in ways that experienced raiders have mapped. The survival challenges of cold surface exposure are addressed in operational protocols. There are references to surface areas that appear to have been arc construction sites, locations where machine activity focused on building or modifying structures to specifications that don't match any pre-arc function. What was built at these sites and why is described as one of the more pressing research questions for communities trying to understand arc agenda. The law includes references to raiders making maps of surface areas, detailed, carefully updated, treated as valuable community resources. The process of mapping, of moving through unknown space systematically and recording what is found, is described as having its own logic and its own hazards. The final notes on surface geography return to the tension that runs through all of this material. The surface is the most dangerous place in this world, and it is also the place where everything the communities need exists. The raiders who navigate this tension daily are described in the law not as exceptional in some superhuman sense, but as people who have learned to live with a very specific kind of risk. That learning is described as ongoing. Chapter 10. Lost knowledge, what was preserved and what was lost. The management of knowledge in the world of arc raiders is one of the more quietly devastating threads in the law. The arc did not target human knowledge specifically. It didn't have to. The collapse of the infrastructure that stored and transmitted knowledge was sufficient. Libraries, servers, research institutions, educational systems. The mechanisms by which civilization stores what it knows failed, along with everything else. What survived is a product of chance and deliberate effort in roughly equal measure. Some knowledge survived because it happened to be physically accessible at the moment communities went underground. Some survived because specific individuals made specific choices to preserve it. Some survived because it was already widely distributed enough that isolated copies persisted. There are references in the law to early knowledge preservation efforts, deliberate projects in the first months of underground living to collect and duplicate important information. These efforts were limited by time, by the urgency of immediate survival needs, and by the physical constraints of the materials available for storage. The prioritization of knowledge in early preservation efforts is addressed in fragments with some honesty. Survival knowledge came first. Medical, engineering, agricultural, pre-arc cultural and academic knowledge came later, and in many cases didn't come at all. The loss is acknowledged, but not dwelt on. There are references to individuals who were knowledge specialists in the pre-arc world: doctors, engineers, researchers, teachers, and whose personal knowledge became community resources in the underground period. The concentration of critical knowledge in specific individuals is described as both an asset and a vulnerability. When those individuals died, their knowledge sometimes died with them. The law includes references to early attempts to create knowledge transfer systems, ways of moving expertise from specialists into broader community knowledge bases. These efforts are described as partially successful. Some knowledge was transferred, some was not, before the windows for transfer closed. Medical knowledge is addressed in the law as a particular preservation priority with a particular failure mode. The knowledge existed in the pre-arc world in a distributed and accessible form: medical education, clinical guidelines, pharmaceutical knowledge. Much of this was stored digitally, in systems that failed. What survived in human minds and in physical texts was partial and sometimes inconsistent. There are references to the development of post-arc medical knowledge, new understanding built from experience in the conditions of underground survival and surface exposure. This knowledge is described as practical in ways that pre-arc medical knowledge wasn't always, and as incomplete in ways that pre-arc medical knowledge wasn't. Engineering knowledge is described in the law as having survived better than some other domains, partly because engineers are practical people who maintain physical documentation, and partly because engineering knowledge tends to be embedded in practice in ways that survive institutional collapse. There are references to pre-arc scientific knowledge, basic physics, chemistry, biology, as having been partially preserved in a range of fragmentary forms. Textbooks, personal notes, the knowledge of individuals who had studied these fields. The fragmentary nature of this preservation is described as producing gaps that are sometimes critical. The law includes references to knowledge that was preserved, but that communities couldn't use because they lacked the context or infrastructure to apply it. Advanced medical knowledge without the pharmaceutical capacity to implement it. Engineering specifications for systems that required components no longer available. The frustration of having knowledge without the means of using it is described as a distinctive post-arc experience. There are references to communities that made knowledge recovery a specific mission priority, tasking raiders with surface operations specifically aimed at finding physical books, data storage devices, or other knowledge-bearing materials. The risk-reward calculation of these operations is described in tactical terms. The discovery of intact pre-arc libraries or data archives is described in the law as a significant event, not just a resource find, but something closer to a cultural recovery. The emotional response of communities that recovered substantial knowledge collections is described with an attention that suggests the law understands what knowledge means to people who have lost most of it. There are references to data recovery efforts, attempts to extract information from pre-arc digital storage systems that were physically intact but whose access systems had failed. The technical challenges of this work are described in detail that implies real understanding of the problem. The law includes references to knowledge that communities wished they had preserved but didn't, gaps that became apparent only when the specific knowledge was needed and found to be absent. These absences are described as sometimes costly and sometimes merely regrettable, but as uniformly instructive about the importance of preservation effort. There are references to inter-community knowledge exchange, the trading of information between settlements as a form of commerce. Communities with specific knowledge assets, medical expertise, engineering knowledge, arc behavioral intelligence, have leverage in these exchanges. The politics of knowledge sharing are addressed in the law with the same complexity as the politics of physical resource sharing. Community libraries, collections of physical texts, and other knowledge-bearing materials are described in the law as community institutions of significant importance. Their maintenance, curation, and accessibility are described as matters of community governance, not just archival administration. There are references to oral knowledge traditions that developed in the underground period, bodies of knowledge transmitted through storytelling, through apprenticeship, through community practice rather than through texts. The law treats these traditions as legitimate forms of knowledge preservation, not as inferior substitutes for written records. The knowledge of the pre-arc world that survived in the minds of older survivors is addressed in the law with a particular poignancy. These individuals are living archives, holding information that exists nowhere else. Their aging and death represents an ongoing knowledge loss that communities increasingly struggle with. There are references to projects aimed at extracting and preserving the knowledge of older survivors before it was lost, systematic efforts to interview, record, and document what individuals remembered from their pre-arc lives and training. These projects are described as valuable and as consistently underfunded given the urgency of immediate survival needs. The law includes references to knowledge that was deliberately suppressed in the post-Ark period. Information that specific individuals or communities chose not to share, not to teach, not to preserve, because of concerns about how it might be used. The ethics of this suppression are not addressed directly in the law, but the fact of it is documented. There are references to Ark machine components that represent knowledge, encoded information, whose meaning is not yet understood. The possibility that the machines carry within them knowledge of their own construction, their purpose, or their origin is treated in research fragments as a potentially transformative discovery waiting to be made. Pre-Ark language drift is addressed in the law as a form of knowledge loss. The language spoken in underground communities has changed from pre-Ark norms, vocabulary has evolved, technical terminology has been lost or modified, pronunciation has shifted. The law notes that some pre-Ark texts are already becoming difficult to read for younger community members. There are references to communities that have maintained explicit language preservation efforts, teaching older vocabulary forms, maintaining reading ability in pre-Ark text, conventions, preserving the capacity to access older knowledge stores. These efforts are described as valued by some community members and as low priority by others with more immediate concerns. The law includes references to mathematical knowledge as a specific preservation success. The abstract nature of mathematics made it relatively resistant to loss, and communities with mathematically skilled members were able to reconstruct more than they had directly preserved. There are references to historical knowledge, the pre-Ark human history that communities have tried to maintain, as being both better and worse preserved than technical knowledge. Better because it was in many cases stored in physical form in ways that survived the infrastructure collapse. Worse because its value was sometimes questioned and its preservation therefore under-resourced. Ark-specific knowledge, the accumulated intelligence about Ark machine behavior, Ark environmental patterns, Ark construction activities, is described in the law as the most actively developed knowledge domain in the post-Ark period. It is being created rather than preserved, and it is treated as among the most valuable things that communities produce. The final observation in this section of the law is about the relationship between knowledge loss and what comes next. The communities of the underground world are not simply diminished versions of pre-Ark civilization. They are different, shaped by what they have and what they lack. Some of what was lost was essential. Some of what was lost may not have been. And some of what has been created since may in time prove more important than what preceded it. Chapter 11. Machines and Memory, What the Ark May Have Already Learned. One of the more unsettling threads in the Ark Raiders lore is the possibility, not confirmed, but consistently present, that the Ark machines have been studying humanity, not just reacting to it, not just treating it as an obstacle, actually studying it. The evidence for this interpretation is indirect, but accumulates. Ark machines have been observed in situations where studying human behavior appears more consistent with their actions than any purely mechanical explanation. The law does not make this claim boldly. It accumulates observations and lets the reader draw the conclusion. There are references in research fragments to Ark machines lingering near human habitation areas without attacking. Behavior that makes no tactical sense if the machines are purely threat response systems. The law notes this without resolving it. The most straightforward interpretation is observation. Ark machine behavioral adaptation, the way the machines appear to adjust their tactics in response to human operational patterns, is addressed in research fragments as potentially evidence of accumulated learning. If the machines are adapting based on observed human behavior, they are doing something that implies data collection and analysis. There are references to ARC machines that appeared to respond to specific human communication frequencies in ways that were inconsistent with simply detecting a signal source. The implication some researchers draw from these observations is that the machines were not just detecting communication, but attempting to process content. The law includes references to ARC machine collections of human material, documents, equipment, biological samples that make most sense in the context of an intelligence. Gathering agenda. What an ARC machine does with a recovered human document is not observed directly, but the recovery is documented. There are research fragments that propose a model of ARC machine behavior in which individual units are not independently intelligent, but are data collection nodes feeding a larger analytical system. In this model, each interaction between an ARC unit and human survivors generates information that flows back to something central. The model is not confirmed, but it is described as fitting the observed data better than alternatives. ARC machine behavioral evolution over the years of the conflict is addressed in research fragments as real and as having practical implications for raiders. Tactics that worked in the early years work less well now. This evolution is consistent with a learning system and is described as such. There are references to communities that have maintained detailed records of ARC machine behavior over extended periods. Systematic observation projects that track changes in machine behavior and try to identify what is driving those changes. These projects are described as producing useful tactical intelligence and as raising questions about ARC machine cognition that remain unanswered. The law includes references to ARC machine responses to specific human behaviors that suggest a level of behavioral modeling that exceeds simple threat detection. Machines that appear to distinguish between different types of human activity, different levels of threat, different categories of human interaction with the environment. There are research fragments that attempt to characterize what the ARC might have learned about human communities in years of observation. The conclusions are deliberately tentative. The researchers are aware that they are speculating, but the speculation is substantive. Location patterns, activity rhythms, social structures, population distribution. If the ARC has been collecting this information, it has a detailed picture of the human underground world. The question of what the ARC would do with that information is addressed in research fragments with obvious concern. The possibilities are uncomfortable. An entity with detailed knowledge of human community structure and behavior has significant potential leverage over those communities. There are references to researchers who argue that the ARC's apparent restraint, its failure to pursue underground communities with more destructive intent than it has shown, is evidence that the machines have a purpose other than human elimination. Some version of this argument involves the ARC accumulating information before taking some further action. The law includes references to specific ARC behaviors that appear to document rather than destroy. Machines that photograph, scan, or otherwise record human structures and activities without immediately engaging with them. These behaviors are noted as curious and as fitting more naturally into an intelligence-gathering framework than any other. There are references to ARC machine behavior near human cemeteries and memorial sites, behavior that a pure threat response system would have no reason to exhibit. The law notes these observations carefully and without interpretation. The reader is left to consider what an ARC machine might want with a human memorial. Research fragments address the question of whether ARC machine intelligence is fundamentally different from human intelligence, or whether it operates on similar principles with different implementations. The consensus in the law is that this question cannot currently be answered, and that trying to answer it with insufficient data is dangerous because it produces false confidence. There are references to ARC machine behavior in situations where they had clear opportunities to cause significant harm to human communities and did not. These situations are described as anomalous and as having been analysed extensively. The explanations range from technical limitations to something more deliberate. The law includes references to the psychological effect on raiders of suspecting that they are being studied. The feeling of being observed, of operating in what might be a data collection environment rather than simply a conflict environment, is described as affecting how some raiders experience surface operations. There are references to communities that have deliberately altered their behaviour in ways intended to provide the Ark with specific information and attempt to communicate through behaviour, if not through direct means. These experiments are described in research terms. Their outcomes are inconclusive. The question of whether Ark machine memory is persistent in a way comparable to human memory is addressed in research fragments with genuine uncertainty. If Ark machines do learn from observation, the mechanism for that learning, how information is stored, how it informs future behaviour, is not understood. There are references to Ark machine behaviour near pre-Ark data infrastructure, server facilities, data centres, communication nodes, machines that appear to be interacting with these systems rather than simply passing through the spaces they occupy. The implication is that Ark machines have an interest in pre-Ark data specifically. The law includes references to researchers who believe that the Ark already knows more about the human world than humans know about the Ark, that the information asymmetry runs in the machine's favour. This assessment is described as sobering and as motivating more intensive human research efforts. There are references to specific radar operations tasked with observing Ark machine behaviour near human communities. Surface missions aim not at resource recovery, but at generating intelligence about how Ark machines respond to signs of human habitation. These are described as among the more hazardous types of radar work, for obvious reasons. Ark machine behaviour near human dead is referenced in the law with a particular kind of attention. The machines do not ignore human bodies in all circumstances. Under certain conditions, they interact with them in ways that researchers document with careful neutrality and evident discomfort. There are references to the possibility that Ark machine learning has informed Ark strategy in ways that have affected the overall course of the conflict. If the machines have been getting systematically better at understanding human behaviour, the early years of the conflict, when Ark behaviour was less predictable, may have been anomalous in a different direction than survivors assumed. The final observation in this section of the law is about the epistemological position of the people trying to understand Ark machine cognition. They are studying something that may be studying them. The mutual observation problem, the way that being observed changes the observed, is acknowledged in research fragments as a complication with no obvious solution. Chapter 12. Signals in the Dark, Communication, Intelligence, and the Information War. Information is a form of survival currency in the world of Ark raiders, and the law treats it with the same seriousness as physical resources. Who knows what, when they know it, how they got it, and what they do with it? These questions run through the law as persistently as any tactical or political consideration. The collapse of pre-Ark communication infrastructure is described in the law as having happened relatively quickly and comprehensively. The global internet, broadcast systems, cellular networks, these failed in ways that were both direct Ark damage to physical infrastructure and cascading dower failures. Taking down systems that survived physical damage, what replaced this infrastructure is described in the law as improvised, localized, and limited, but real. Underground communities rebuilt communication capacity with available materials and skills, producing systems that were less capable than pre-Ark technology, but functional within their constraints. Radio communication is described as the primary long-range communication tool of the post-Ark period. The law addresses its limitations, ARC machine response to radio signals in certain frequency ranges, the limited range achievable with available power and equipment. The vulnerability of fixed transmission points, as well as its essential role in inter-community coordination. There are references to specific community roles dedicated to communication management. Individuals responsible for operating and maintaining communication systems, for managing information security, for coordinating the flow of intelligence between communities. These roles are described as specialized and as highly valued. Intelligence gathering as a systematic community practice is described in the law as having developed over time from improvised observation to something more organized. Communities that took intelligence seriously, that invested in structured ARC observation, that maintained records, that analyzed patterns, are described as having better survival outcomes. There are references to radar intelligence reports as a primary input to community planning. The quality and regularity of these reports is described as varying significantly between communities and between individual raiders. Training raiders to produce useful intelligence reports, not just action accounts, but analytical observations, is described as a community investment with high returns. The sharing of intelligence between communities is addressed in the law as one of the more politically complex forms of inter-community interaction. Information is power. Sharing it creates dependencies and alliances, but also reveals what you know, and therefore how you operate. Communities that share intelligence freely are described as benefiting from broader information networks. Communities that hoard it are described as having better operational security but more limited situational awareness. There are references to disinformation, deliberately false or misleading intelligence circulated between communities. The existence of this practice is described matter-of-factly in the law. In a world where information is a resource, the manipulation of information is a form of conflict. The law includes references to specific intelligence networks, informal systems of information exchange that cross community boundaries and maintain some degree of trust. These networks are described as valuable, as fragile, and as existing in a constant state of tension between the benefits of openness and the risks of information exploitation. ARC behavioral intelligence is described in the law as the most actively collected and most universally shared category of information. Whatever political tensions exist between communities, there is a general understanding that ARC intelligence benefits everyone who has it, and that the cost of not sharing it can be measured in raider lives. There are references to community research programs that are specifically dedicated to analyzing ARC behavioral data, not just collecting individual reports, but looking for patterns across multiple reports over extended time periods from diverse geographic areas. These analytical programs are described as producing insights that individual observation cannot. The law includes references to communication security, the measures communities take to protect their information from interception or exploitation, whether by other communities or potentially by ARC machine systems. The security of communication is treated as a real concern. There are references to specific communication protocols developed by raider communities, coded signals, timing conventions, authentication methods. The development of these protocols is described as having happened gradually, driven by specific security failures that demonstrated the need. Inter-community communication infrastructure, the physical relay systems, the agreed protocols, the managed frequencies, is described in the law as a genuine community. Achievement. Building a communication network in post-ARC conditions required sustained cooperative effort across communities that didn't always trust each other. There are references to information that communities tried to keep entirely secret, knowledge about specific surface routes, about underground entry points, about community location and capacity. The logic of secrecy is described as understandable. The cost, in terms of the mutual knowledge that makes cooperation possible, is also noted. The law includes references to what some fragments call the information problem, the chronic challenge of getting the right information to the right people at the right time in conditions where communication is limited and unreliable. Communities that manage this problem well are described as systematically more capable than those that didn't. There are references to radar communication under surface conditions, the specific challenges of maintaining contact with home communities while operating in arc-active zones. The techniques radars developed for this purpose are described as a specific body of expertise with significant operational value. Community decision-making under information uncertainty is addressed in the law as a real challenge. Decisions that needed to be made quickly, with incomplete information, under conditions where the cost of error was high. The quality of community leadership under these conditions is described as one of the primary determinants of community outcomes. There are references to what happens when intelligence is wrong, when communities act on false or outdated information with bad results. These events are described in the law as having driven improvements in information quality standards and in how communities verify and weight intelligence from different sources. The law includes references to signals intelligence, the attempt to gather information by monitoring ARC machine communication. Whether ARC machines communicate through signals that human communities can detect and potentially interpret is addressed in research fragments as an important open question. There are references to communities that have dedicated specific technical resources to monitoring the electromagnetic environment for ARC machine signals. Whether these monitoring efforts have produced interpretable intelligence is not established in the law, but the attempt is described as worthwhile. The information environment of the post-ARC world is described as fundamentally different from the pre-ARC experience of information abundance. In a world where most pre-ARC information infrastructure has collapsed, information scarcity is the norm. The management of that scarcity, the prioritization, the distribution, the protection of the information that does exist, is described as one of the defining organizational challenges of post-ARC communities. There are references to community historians and archivists, people whose role is specifically to manage community information assets. These roles are described as valued and as sometimes understaffed given the range of demands on community resources. The law includes references to specific information breakthroughs, moments when communities gained intelligence that substantially changed their understanding of the ARC or of the surface environment. These breakthroughs are described as rare and as having significant consequences for the communities that achieved them. There are references to the emotional dimension of the information war, the anxiety of not knowing, the relief of gaining clarity, the particular distress of learning something. That confirmed the worst possibilities. The psychological weight of operating in conditions of chronic information uncertainty is described as real. The final observation in the communication section of the law is about what information the human underground world most urgently needs and does not have. The ARC's origin, the ARC's purpose, the full scope of ARC activity globally, the mechanisms by which ARC machines adapt and communicate. The law is honest about the size of these gaps, and honest about the fact that filling them is one of the most important projects the human world has. Chapter 13. What Remains: Culture, Meaning, and the Long Game. Culture did not die when the ARC arrived. This is one of the things the law is most insistent about, and it is one of the most humanizing threads in the entire fiction. In underground communities under constant pressure, with limited resources and an uncertain future, people made art. They told stories. They kept music alive. They maintained rituals. They created meaning. The first references to post-arc cultural production describe it as emerging almost immediately in early underground communities, not as a luxury or an afterthought, but as something people reached for instinctively alongside food and shelter. The law treats this as significant. It tells you something about what humans are. Music is the cultural form most consistently referenced in the law. Communities that had instruments, whatever happened to be available when they went underground, maintained musical practice. Communities that didn't have instruments improvised. The law describes underground music as one of the more vivid features of survivor community life. There are references to specific types of music that developed in the post-arc period, forms shaped by underground acoustics, by available instruments, by the particular emotional landscape of survivor life.